This is it. Welcome to the final week of our course. It's been so fantastic so far. We've had really amazing speakers, I think you'll agree. And we've been just really impressed with you all, the contributions you've made, the work you've submitted. And so I want to thank you for being such great active participants in this course. And we're excited to have a really great panel for our final week here. And with that, I want to turn it over to our first panelist today, Dr. Petersen.
I'm muted, of course. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Petersen. Some of you guys have seen me or heard my face or heard from me this summer because I am in charge of the team that has been working hard to prepare you academically. The other part of my role at USD, besides being an associate dean and working on preparing the campus for first years and getting ready for you, is that I'm a professor. I'm a professor of Spanish in the Language, Cultures, and Literatures department. I teach Latin American studies, and I'm a specialist in literature and cultural studies. And since you guys are learning all about different disciplines and what they are and what they mean and how they can help you in your examination of the world and how you understand and process and unpackage the world, I wanted to just kind of talk to you a little bit about what literary studies are and what cultural studies are. And you will see this in the pieces that I'm going to talk about today. So I know that you guys have all taken literature classes. You've probably taken, classic lit, like, Shakespeare or Jane Austen, or classic American lit. I don't usually teach those kind of classic canonical literature pieces. And if you guys could remember to mute as you're coming in, I know that is something that we all forget when we're coming in. I tend to teach pieces that have been forgotten by the official dominant narrative of what literature is. And I also tend to teach authors that have often been excluded from the canon or the dominant narrative of what literature is, for being a certain gender, for being from a certain class background, or for being from a certain ethnographic or racial population. Primarily in Mexico. I also teach literature of the border and the northern region, and I teach some kind of border literature in the US, but Dr. Pulido, who will wrap us up, is the expert in that on this campus in many ways. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk us through how I think about and read monuments. And you guys might be like, what is that? What does that have to do with literature? What does that have to do with cultural studies? And let me give you just kind of a quick summary, an easy summary of what maybe cultural studies is. So cultural studies, in a way, when I look at literature, I'm looking at the historical, socio background of literature and how that's playing out in the text that we read. But when we're doing cultural studies, the quote unquote texts aren't necessarily like books, like literal texts. Sometimes they are tweets. Sometimes they are actual things that we find on the street, such as graffiti, and you'll see some of these examples. Sometimes it's reading the cultural symbolic nature that shows intersectional discrimination. It shows the realities of our society, that is the inequities and discrimination that are present in our society. And sometimes it shows us how those things are constructed in ways that we don't really know. So if I were to really just be really simple about what cultural studies is, it asks us to question the construction of things that we often don't think need to be questioned. And also it prompts us to ask who is curating and telling this story, why they're doing it, what their reasons are before it, and who's consuming it, and also who's silenced, who's erased, who's not present. Okay, so the first thing, and I'm about to share my slides, that I want you to do is I want you to just put in the chat some monument that you remember having seen at any given point. It doesn't matter if it's from the US and national, just put it in the chat, some kind of monument that okay, Cabrillo, great. Keep going. And actually, I said that wrong. It's Cabrillo, because Cabrillo is Portuguese. So that the Washington Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, Statue of Liberty. Ooh, we got busy here. Washington Monument, Lincoln, the Pisa, 9/11.
Can you repeat the question one more time? Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, some monument that you've seen anywhere. I'll start sharing my slides. I just got a little, I think I have too many windows open, so I confuse myself. Give me 1 second. I lost my Chicano Park. That's great because we have an expert in Chicano Park here today, which I'm thrilled about. So a lot of these are really kind of classic monuments. Lincoln, the White House, yes, the White House is built with lots of symbols, and Chichen Itza, a little bit more of a ruin, but definitely has a monumental kind of presence. Great, so the Hearst Castle, there's lots of different things. And so thanks for that. It helps me to kind of see where you guys have been maybe have seen things, and I am looking for the right, here we go. And then would one of you also confirm that this is just, it doesn't have any speaker notes or anything like that, it's just the slides, is that correct? Okay, thanks. So my area of research is focuses on kind of literary and cultural discourse, including kind of graffiti and protests and hashtags around the protests of gender violence. But I'm really going to focus on it from the point of view of monuments today. So you guys just gave me a whole bunch of different monuments that you've seen and memorials including like the 9/11. And so the 9/11 one is fascinating because it takes a different point of view in terms of a monument. It tries to tell multiple stories. So the critical questions that I was kind of talking about, what are monuments? What are they? What do they represent? What stories do they tell? What stories do they exclude? Who decides the version of the story that is included and told here? And then another question is always, are we invited in that memorial or in this exhibit to question what the symbolism of that is? So for example, when you go to Cabrillo and the point, there are little points in that, if you read the whole exhibit, that might ask us to question a little bit what the nature of a monument like that is, including that, Cabrillo ultimately was a conquistador who discovered this land. But lots of monuments don't necessarily. If you think of the Lincoln Memorial, it's very impressive, it's very imposing, and it's not asking us necessarily to question who we see as a national hero. So I was starting with this example, and this is the Angel of Independence in Mexico City. This is a iconic memorial that was built in Mexico City. It is a common tourist spot, as you can kind of see by the people who are coming close. It's on the Avenida Reforma, which is an iconic street as well. It was built in colonial times, and it was especially made fancy during the Porfiriato, during the 1800s, to kind of be a symbol of the civilization and the excellence of Mexico City and the capital. At this memorial is the Angel of Independence. It was originally constructed to commemorate the independence of 1810. The date is somewhat debatable in some ways because the War of Independence in all of Latin America was not just a one-off day, and was actually quite complicated in contrast to the national story that is usually told about independence in Mexico and all other countries. So this is, if you were to guess, how would you read that Angel of Independence, and would you say that maybe she has a certain message that is trying to come across? Does it remind you of any of those monuments that you mentioned? And you can put it in the chat. And I think, I'm trying to see the chat. Okay, here we go. Great. Excellent. That was definitely the thing that I was thinking about, was the Statue of Liberty. It's a very common, oops, I am sharing the wrong, what happened there? So it is a very common memorial kind of symbolic move to use the Lady Liberty image to talk about freedom, excellence, the kind of morals of a nation that we all kind of learn in elementary school, and that we don't always learn to question and think about critically. So as we are talking about this, I want to give you an example that I find funny and humorous, and you'll have to bear with me. I am the granddaughter of a funeral home director, so I have the ability to talk about kind of ruins and remains really easily with humor. So one of the things that fascinates me so much about the Angel of Independence. So in 1910, when there were a whole bunch of centennial 100-year celebrations for the War of Independence, these urns were placed at the bottom in that base of the Angel of Independence. And so when you go up there, it'll say, here are the remains of our national heroes that fought and lost their lives for the independence of this nation from, the colonial power. So in 100 years later, fast forward to 2010, we have DNA tests and abilities to test out, to test with ancestors of these national heroes, to kind of test DNA and see what it is. Well, what they discovered in 100 years later with DNA testing was that each of those urns didn't just have the bones and the remains of one independence hero. And in fact, it had unidentified peoples in there, and each one was kind of mixed up and it wasn't kind of in their general resting place, which is typically a pretty solid no-no in terms of remains and funerary practices. And even more kind of humorous to me is that in 2000, I think it was a couple years later in 2011 or 2012, it was so complicated that they couldn't exactly extract and separate, and they kind of kept them in a very similar way. So one of my colleagues, when we were talking about this for research reasons, she was like, oh, you should just write an article about this called Mixed Up Bones. But I'm using this kind of humor and tongue in cheek because one of the things we look at when we're looking at this sort of monument is that we look at an absolute truth. We look at the absolute moral of a country, this absolute image and symbol of liberty, very much like the Statue of Liberty, but we don't always look at that monument and say, these are the ways in which we're not living up to that moral and that goal and that so-called national value, and what are ways in which we should question these images and pictures to have a clearer and more critical view of these sorts of things. So I'm introducing to you kind of one general term. It's about nostalgia. And Svetlana Boym was a historian and scholar of nostalgia. She was from Russia, and or the former Soviet Union, and she studied all of these kind of monuments and nostalgia movements during the fall of the Soviet Union. And so she would look at these monuments that would be restorative, for example, like this, the Angel of Independence. And then she would look at reflexive monuments or nostalgia that would be toppled Soviet Union heroes with heads, and sometimes there would be graffiti on it, or sometimes there would be monuments that were broken, but then they were left and new plaques would be erected to explain the moment in which these monuments were toppled. So I'm introducing you to this notion of a restorative nostalgia is traffics in absolutes. It erases doubts and contradiction. It does not invite us to ask questions, to question how this might have been created, what are the politics and the critical thinking that needs to go on behind this. And reflexive nostalgia really calls into attention ambivalences. It really highlights the doubts. It breaks up that single narrative. And if you haven't ever watched this TED Talk by this fabulous author and feminist activist, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I always say her last name wrong, and I apologize for not having that clear in my head. Definitely go to TED Talk and watch it, because she has a really fascinating account of how it is so dangerous to only sell a single story, set the things that monuments sell us of a restorative that focuses solely on a single truth and doesn't help us question the realities and the complications of that history. So just as a reminder. Now, if any of you guys have ever seen pictures of the plaza at Mexico City, it's an enormous plaza. This is an aerial photo, so you can see how huge this space might be because of the size of the people. And this is a space that it has a huge flag, like it's massive, one of the biggest flags I've ever seen. Of Mexico. It's right in front of the National Palace. It's also in front of the I'm losing my words for it, the church, the main church. That's it's a cathedral right in front. Thanks. And then there's a hotel and all of these sorts of things that are really kind of the presence of the nation. So this was from a few years ago, and I'll talk about some of these movements a little bit more specifically. But these were names of women who were missing or murdered in the past several years in Mexico. And it was an act that took this kind of national monument of around this big flagpole, put words on it, and made it into a monument that makes us question how the nation might be complicit in the murder and violence of women. An interesting kind of note is that the next day, they had erased it in this way, but that we have aerial pictures to show it. So what I want to kind of show you is, and this has happened more than once, more than just 2019, is I want to show you and talk just a little bit about, there have been lots of protests around gender violence and women's rights and feminism in Latin America. In Mexico in particular, there are movements that have been focused in particular around femicide, which is the murder of women because they are women. And it was very controversial in the news, and this might sound familiar if you follow the news in the US around national monuments or graffiti and protest type discourse. This was in the news a lot. So this is that angel of independence that you saw the picture of, and that very like formal, denying of doubt, absolute truth type of monument. And then we have graffiti around it that has words like, we're going to burn down, and the subject of that is the patriarchy. Words that describe the state as being complicit in not protecting and forming structures that don't enable the murder and disappearance of women, including women professionals like journalists. And there was lots of discussion, as you might imagine, of what is this vandalism? Is this protest? Is this art? What is this, and how do we interpret it? What I would really like for you to focus on, kind of as I'm talking, and we don't have a whole lot more time, is about this notion of restorative versus reflexive nostalgia and monuments. So reflexive, again, invites us to say, what is a story underneath these, and what are the ways in which we can really look at monuments that are getting us to look behind the curtain of these dominant discursive structures. Here's another kind of picture. This was actually from, it was a meme from the people who organized these kind of protests, and they call themselves curators or restorers with glitter. And there's a whole story about the glitter part too that I won't have time to tell. So this might sound familiar, and there's been some discussions of Christopher Columbus. Colón is Columbus in Spanish. And this is what was called formerly the Glorieta de Colón. So it was like the roundabout with a monument of Christopher Columbus on here. This has been a discussion that's been happening all over the world, but in particular in the US, Spain, and Latin America. What is the role of figures like Christopher Colón or conquistadores who really came and started genocide in all of the continents in the name of the Catholic throne, and also in the name of colonizing certain spaces. So in this particular memorial, I'm sure that you guys can all kind of notice, this is definitely a restorative type of monument, right? We have a hero. We don't have any kind of questioning. I have been there before it was changed, and there weren't plaques that were asking us to question the complicated legacy of colonialism in Mexico, or the complicated legacy of the quote unquote discovery of the US, which is, as a Latin Americanist, I never use the word of the discovery. I might say the encounter, the first encounter, not discovery, because these were lands that were already lived on. So this is definitely not a reflexive nostalgia and kind of monument, but what I do want to show you is how it has been transformed. And the picture that is behind me in the screen is part of a memorial that's around this, that's now called, instead of the Glorieta de Colón, it is the Glorieta de Mujeres que Luchan, of women who resist, who fight. And so you can see, and it looks almost like a shadow in this picture. I think I have another one that's a little bit better. This woman who has her fist up in the air, it's a universal common symbol of resistance and fighting. And we'll see a couple other pictures that have, so you can see that the Christopher Columbus statue is no longer there. You can see that there's kind of an outline of a woman and the women who erected her there. And I don't have a good picture right now, but all of these walls around there are now written with women who are missing, who have been murdered, women who have protested and made a difference in society. And there are flags that also have kind of those kind of similar things. This is another kind of artistic depiction. And one of the ways that I talk about this also is kind of this haunting of how when we're looking at a restorative monument, we hide any kind of ghost that could be haunting the story, that could complicate the story. But when we do a reflexive nostalgia and a reflexive monument, we are acknowledging that there's lots of past and futures that will impact the story that we're telling of this moment. And we allow for different sorts of waking up and different complexities of truth to be shown. So I do have just two more little things. So one of the movements that I think is really fascinating in Mexico around social protests is the anti-monument movement. I've picked this one because it has to do with gender violence, but there are also two, I think there are now three, that have to do with historical political protests and victims who've lost their lives in historical protests. Behind that really fancy building with the amazing roof, you can see a very formal, it is called the Palacio de Bellas Artes. It's about fine arts. There's amazing concerts in there. There's mind-blowing exhibits, very, very formal, very in the realm of what the cultural image the nation wants to show. And in front of that, we have what is called an anti-monument. And what they talk about in the anti-monument is they want, in these tourist areas of Mexico City, to have moments of disruption. Moments, I call them also like spectral moments, these moments when this ghost kind of appears and shocks you into a different reality and helps to show the complexity of the story that we're seeing. So the last image that I'm going to show you, and I really just want you to think about the questions that I've asked you to think about, and how we can examine different stories and narratives that are shown to us in all sorts of different ways, including around our campus. It's a very fascinating tour to take of campus to ask yourself, what are the restorative type memorials that take place in the names of our buildings, in the statues that we have up around campus. And there's a lot of history that can be uncovered and excavated in that kind of tour. And one of my jobs in this talk was to kind of bring us to the border. And I could have done a whole talk about kind of border monuments, but they're a little bit more complicated to explain. But this one also gives us insight into how art can also be a form of protest in public art. So this is a mural that has, in the last, I think it's about 4 years old, that was painted in Mexicali. It is right along the line that you wait when you're in your car to cross the border, but it is precisely about protesting gender violence and raising awareness to gender violence in a public space. So while you're going along your normal kind of wait to cross the border, where you might see, you might buy tacos, you might be bored waiting in line, it is this moment that disrupts us and wakes us up and reminds us that there are greater social justices that we need to pay attention even as we're in our daily lives. So with that, I will pass off to our next speaker, which I believe is Dr. LaFleur.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm glad that you're here today, and I'm happy to be speaking to you. So I am going to talk more about the border, and I've called my talk the U.S.-Mexico border and the violence of its maintenance. I am an anthropologist. Specifically, I'm a biological anthropologist. And as you may guess from my background here, I'm really interested in lemurs. So biological anthropology studies what it means to be human through a biological lens. And so we study humans, but we also study non-humans, our closest relatives, the non-human primates as well. So I have studied lemurs for a really long time, almost 20 years, but I'm kind of branching out because I'm also interested in social justice issues, particularly those that are happening close to me. And like Dr. Petersen, I have the ability and an interest in death and the processes in death and the way that we process death and how the rituals surrounding death. And some people have the ability to delve into depth and some people don't. This is one of the things that I can do. So on first introduction, it might seem a little bit morbid, but I find it really very interesting and think that it's also very important. Okay. So here is, I just wanted to start with a quote by Harsha Walia, and this is that every border implies the violence of its maintenance. So I just want to get you thinking about borders and how they can actually cause damage, particularly to humans and human bodies. And I just will give you an overview of what I will talk about. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I'm talking about the US-Mexico border and the violence that occurs surrounding that, I think a lot of people, when you start talking about this, that's my dog Banana, she's just saying hi. When you start talking about this, people automatically think in the back of their head about why people who are trying to enter the US don't just do this legally. And so, thank you, yes. Hi, Banana. So I just want to cover that very briefly first so that we can all get that out of our heads. And then I will talk about different types of violence. I will give you a little bit of background about the US portion of the US-Mexico border policies. And then I will talk about disappearing bodies and disappearing lives and sustaining violence. So how this violence is sustained by policies. And then I'll finish with what you can do. And I meant to put my timer on here. It's now on. Okay. So first thing, why don't people enter legally? So this is something that we hear in the news or in popular conversation when there are talks about immigration and people being in America. People often will say, well, if they would just come legally, it would be fine. Or if they would just come legally, they wouldn't end up dead. And so I just want to point out that for a lot of people, this simply isn't an option. So many undocumented immigrants who want to come to be citizens of the United States simply cannot just get in line. There isn't a line for them to fit into. And although there are some lines, you can go to the border and physically get into lines. Many people who aspire to be lawful residents of the United States simply aren't eligible for them for a whole bunch of reasons. And so even if a person does meet the formal requirements to immigrate into the United States, the wait can be very long and the barrier to entry is very high. So you have to have money in order to process applications. You have to spend a lot of time doing this. And some people simply don't have that time. Most people, or not, a lot of people that are trying to enter the United States or that need to enter the United States are doing so for protection of themselves or their family members, or there may be urgent financial reasons that they need to start working and they can't be waiting for several months or even several years in order to be admitted. So we'll consider this as we're talking about how people actually do enter the United States, knowing that this sort of get in line is not an option for many people. And the next thing I want to talk about, this is a triangle that talks about violence, and this is Galtung's violence triangle. And so there are 3 points to this. One is direct violence, another is structural violence, and the last is cultural violence. And I'll just explain what each of these are. So structural violence, and who has heard of this before? Just let me know, have you heard of structural violence before? Am I just giving you this definition here? If you have, let me know, give me a yes or a thumbs up. I'm not seeing, oh, okay, I got a couple of responses. I don't see anything in chat, but yes, I see some yeses and I see some thumbs up. So, okay, great. So some people have heard of this before, but maybe you haven't. If you haven't, what structural violence is ways in which social, economic, and political system expose groups of people to risks and vulnerabilities that basically make their lives bad. So increase morbidity or mortality. So these systems that are in place that could cause people to be unwell or to die. Then there's direct violence. We can all think of this. We know what direct violence is. It threatens life itself and or diminishes one's capacity to meet their basic needs. And the third is cultural violence. And this is when any aspect of a culture is used to legitimize violence, either in direct or structural forms. So this makes the violence that occurs seem normal and natural and something that is inevitable, and will often act to blame the victim of the violence as well. So I'll come back to these closer to the end of the talk, but keep in mind each of these 3 types of violence. Okay, and as I said, I just want to give you a bit of a background of the US-Mexico border policy, and this is a really relatively recent policy, so I'm going to be talking about policies since 1994. And 1994 was when NAFTA was enacted. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. Sorry, as soon as I went to say it there, I lost it. So North American Free Trade Agreement. So this is an agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And it's essentially put in place to facilitate the transportation of goods, transportation and sale of goods. But what happened was this really destabilized the economy in Mexico. So prices really fell for some things, and also it boosted the American economy because the American economy got a bunch of agricultural subsidies by way of NAFTA. So suddenly there was very different economic trends going on, both in Mexico and America. And in America, there was this increased fear that because of this economy, that there would be increased immigration and potentially increased illegal immigration, so undocumented immigration. And so alongside with NAFTA, there was a program implemented called Prevention Through Deterrence. And this was put in place by the Clinton administration. So this was also 1994. And right here in south of San Diego at San Ysidro, that's the area, the region of southern San Diego that is along the border, what was put into place, or the Prevention Through Deterrence I can't think of what, the program put in place here was called Operation Gatekeeper. And so what that was thousands more Border Patrol agents were put in place near San Ysidro, or in San Ysidro, or along the border ranging from San Ysidro. And the Sonoran Desert was largely left unguarded. So what we have now, if you think about the border with Mexico in California, we have a concentration of Border Patrol agents, thousands of Border Patrol agents concentrated in one region. And then we have the rest of the border within California is almost unguarded. And so the rationale for this was that the hostile nature of the desert would deter undocumented migrants from entering the US. So it was said that because of how very hot and dry and very hostile this desert is to human life and to mammalian life, that people would not come through. So they essentially didn't need to have border guards there because the desert would be too difficult and too scary for people to try to enter through. But if you think about the risk versus the reward, it turns out that the desert is not a successful deterrent, despite being extremely risky to cross on foot. And that's because the potential reward outweighs the risk for many people. So if you think of being an undocumented person who is fleeing from violence or fears that their family will be killed, potentially crossing the desert on foot, you at least have the potential to live through it. Whereas if you are imminently fearful for your life, or you might think that it's more risky to stay put. So the risk reward is just in favor of seeking to cross through the desert. And so what happens is that this prevention through deterrence actually results in quite significant suffering and deaths of individuals. And in this way, the desert is being used as a silent weapon. And the thing that's really insidious about this is if we think if somebody was using an actual weapon, like a gun or some kinds of physical weapons to kill people that were coming across the border, there would be noise, there would be some kinds of attention, there would be bodies that people would see. But when it's the desert that is doing this work, we don't see it. We don't hear anything. Very few people witness it, and the bodies of individuals may or may not be found. And so what I'm going to show you next, I want to warn you about. It depicts the decomposition of a pig. So it shows a dead animal and the processes of decomposition. So if you don't want to look at it and you just want to turn off your screen and listen, that would be just fine. So one of the questions that I've been pursuing is looking at how many people are being disappeared by the desert in California. We really don't know. For a whole bunch of reasons, this information is not easy to access, but I'm investigating this and really want to know how many people this is happening to. We can't ever know the true number. We can only know the numbers of individuals that are found, if that makes sense, because there are going to be individuals that are not found that we don't know about. So we can only know the numbers that are found and recognize that that's a subset of the total number of people that may die in the desert. Okay, so this is a short video. I think it's about 3 minutes. And this is where you will see the remains of the pigs.
The desert will kill you, and then vultures will rip you to shreds, and then your body will disappear. For many years, pigs have been the kind of standard substitute for a human body. They have a similar organ distribution, similar skin type, weight, and so they're about as close as we can get to a human body in this context. Pigs have been killed on site. They've been put into 4 different locations. 2 animals are unclothed and 2 animals are fully clothed. So they're dressed as we would expect migrants to be dressed. And we will monitor scavenging activity using motion sensor trail cameras that are set on each of these animals, as well as researchers who will go out twice a day to do different measurements on the decomposition process.
We see these increasing number of deaths in the southern Arizona desert, but we don't necessarily know if we have the methods or the ability to assess accurately how long it's been since these people have died.
So if someone dies outside on the surface of the desert, the remains are not protected from the wind and animal activity and birds and coyotes and everything else. A lot of these bones will be carried away and you won't find them.
Ideally, we would use cadavers donated by people who are sort of interested in contributing to science, but there isn't a facility that's capable of doing that here in southern Arizona. So the next best thing in this case are pig corpses. Clothing was an important decision because, migrants typically die fully clothed. And so we kind of want to see how the clothing will impact the scavenging compared to the two animals that are unclothed. And we'll check the footage tomorrow.
Okay. We are seeing obviously a huge difference in scavenging activity on the pigs that have clothes versus the ones that don't. In fact, we expected that scavenging would kind of disperse skeletal elements along the way, but I don't think anybody expected that an entire body would be completely missing.
Looks like a toe.
Now that we've seen that an entire pig has been carried away, that tells us a lot, especially that, if a body is found in the desert, that doesn't necessarily mean that that location is where they died.
Oh, there's a lot more.
Yes.
This environment and this system that funnels people through the desert literally kills them and then cleans up the mess. If you can imagine this pig that's dressed like a human, if you can imagine that as a person, and then to see these birds come in there and just rip this person to shreds, if you can kind of imagine then that this happens to people, it becomes incredibly disturbing. We're working against a clock. I mean, literally, nature is destroying these bodies and making it impossible for us to ever have a good count on the number of folks who die.
Okay. Well, oh no. No.
Here we are.
Sorry.
Our main story tonight concerns something that's been getting more and more urgent over the past 2 months.
Okay, we won't watch monkeypox. Maybe next time. We won't watch monkeypox today. Okay, so that was just to show you how individuals can actually be disappeared by the terrain. And as I said, the challenging part about this, or the really difficult thing, is that that we don't know what we don't know. So if individuals are disappeared, we will never know that they were even there. It's possible that there's no trace left. Okay, so I'm just going to continue to talk about this a little bit. How many people are being disappeared? So 2 counties that straddle the US-Mexico border within California. One that you're either in or you will be coming to very soon is San Diego County, and the next is Imperial County. So if we look at this in a different way, here's San Diego County, it's outlined in red, and then Imperial County is outlined in, also outlined in red, but on the right-hand side. And so if you look at San Diego County, keep in mind that there, along here at San Ysidro, there are thousands and thousands of Border Patrol agents.
Marni, do you want to reshare your screen? Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll just back up one slide here. So we're looking at San Diego and Imperial County. And here we go again. These are the counties with the topography here. Remember that there are thousands of agents along here near San Ysidro, so near San Diego, and not so many agents along the remainder of the border, although there is a marked population or marked group of agents or a Border Patrol at Calexico. So what you see here is that lots of this area, what the point is that I want to make about this is that if people are coming, when people are coming and crossing on foot into California, they're most likely going to be doing this in some way of Imperial County. So we don't have a lot of information about when remains are found, how many remains are found, but we do know that they're likely to come through in these areas of the desert. And if we look at what has been happening in Imperial County, where we think the majority of these individuals would be found. We look at the records from Imperial County, and we know that in Imperial County, they were burying unidentified remains until 2009. And unfortunately, what happened in 2009 is that this cemetery filled, and there wasn't any more land purchased that could be used to bury people. And so at that time, the county began cremating individuals and then scattering their remains at sea. And so this is significant and important because this is another way that people are being disappeared. If there isn't a physical, there's nothing physical from somebody, there's no monument, there's no gravesite, there's no place to go, the person essentially ceases to exist for the rest of us. And so their death goes unnoticed. And so this is another way people now, since 2020, are being cremated and interred. So this is a slight improvement. But again, this is a way that the system, not the desert, acts to disappear people. Another way to kind of to think about how many people are being disappeared is through apprehensions. So we know that there's a correlation between the number of individuals that are picked up by Border Patrol or have encounters with Border Patrol. We know that there's a correlation there, and we know that the numbers of people that are apprehended correlate with the numbers of people that are crossing on foot. We just don't know what exactly that correlation is. So we don't know if it's for every one person that's apprehended, there's one person that attempts to cross on foot, and then how many people of all of those, if we make it 100, how many of those are likely to die? We just don't know, but we know that there's a correlation, and we know that the number of apprehensions has increased fairly dramatically, that it did increase fairly dramatically with the Trump administration. So this is increasing regardless of what the actual number are. We know that it's increasing. And so if we go back to this structure, the triangle of violence, I will argue that the US border policy commits structural, direct, and cultural violence against undocumented migrants. And so I've sort of outlined how that structural violence is, and I'll just give some examples about direct and cultural violence. So this is an image from Chicano Park. I really encourage you to go down there when you get to San Diego. So evidences of direct violence, this can be seen in abuse of power.
Oh, you're muted.
First day back with technology, this can be seen in abuse of power, violence, and deaths caused by Border Patrol and other individuals, but I'm focusing on Border Patrol during apprehensions and detention. And so all you have to do is Google this. One sort of well-known case is Anastasio Hernandez Rojas. And this is his wife here standing in front of his mural that is in Chicano Park. And his case will be heard by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So this is an ongoing saga. He died in 2010, but this is something that is still somewhat unresolved. Another thing to look at are the conditions of children being kept by detention centers. And then also records of things like physical and sexual abuse at the border. So there is lots of evidence of direct violence. And again, go to Chicano Park. It's beautiful to see, and I really encourage you to go. And then evidences of cultural violence. So as I said, cultural violence acts to legitimize and normalize violence and to blame the victim rather than the perpetrator. And I can't think of, well, I think it's a really significant thing that our former president said things like this about the people that we're talking about or thinking about right now. So when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending its best. This is his quote. They're sending people that have a lot of problems, and they're bringing those problems with them. with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some I assume are good people. So this is not creating a picture that is going to support and allow migrants to flourish. This is creating a very negative and demeaning image that is going to result in things like increase in hate crimes and increase in discrimination within society. And that has also been documented. So we know that this is impactful and impacts people's lives. And so what I'd just like to say in sum is that undocumented migrants often don't have the option to enter the US by legal means. And again, that the border policy commits structural, direct, and cultural violence against these individuals. And I want to end with a couple of things, and one being looking at what you can do, because when we hear of, or when we learn about really large, unjust events or situations, it can be very overwhelming, and we don't know. We think, what can I do? This is too difficult, too challenging, too big, too overwhelming. But you actually can do things yourself. So I encourage you to reflect on the ways that you view migration and migrants, and employ your highly developed primate skills of empathy and compassion for your fellow humans. I encourage you to vote strategically for candidates and policies that protect the most vulnerable. I encourage you to tell others, and I encourage you to learn more. So this is an image from the Tijuana side of the US-Mexico border that has been said to be the love portion of the art that is depicted here. And so for the discussion section, I'll open up this idea of disappearing bodies, but also I asked you to read a passage from Crooks, and that specifically talks about the axolotl. So this is an axolotl here. If you don't know what it is, it's a really cool salamander that is able to regenerate all of its limbs. So it's important and interesting in scientific terms, but the analogies made about the axolotls, we'll use that to compare to migrants and how migrants are pictured or viewed by society. Okay, thank you very much. That's all for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. LaFleur. That was so fascinating. We're going to roll right along here, and our next speaker is Dr. Amrein.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, it's lovely to be with you. I'm going to just share my screen real quick. To share your computer audio. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. My name is Emilie Amrein, and I am in the music department here at USD. And I am so grateful for the opportunity to talk to you and for my colleagues who have introduced so many of the key areas of my thinking lately and in fascinating presentations. And so I'm going to talk about some of these same things, right? Having to do with the border, but from a kind of music perspective and a music perspective writ large, right? So we think about music, of course, as the objects and processes orally and temporally that we encounter as human beings, that we create and participate in, that we listen and consume. And my work as a musician has really branched out into other areas of creative work. And I'm just thinking in particular of Dr. LaFleur's introduction of the Galtung triangle of violence. When I am thinking about my own work, I think of Galtung's triangle and interventions that we can do to interrupt cycles of violence from a direct perspective, from a structural perspective, and from a cultural perspective. And my work as a cultural practitioner interacts with these topics and these violences in a way that's meant to participate in intervening and interrupting cycles of violence. So my talk is called Of Moments and Movement, Storying Migration and Memory at the US-Mexico Border. And my talk is kind of divided into some segments, and I'll kind of just introduce them briefly as we come to them. The first is about story in general. I took a class much like this when I was an incoming first-year student at Indiana University many years ago. And the course was called The Stories We Live By. And it really introduced an idea that stuck with me now for 25 years, right? Thinking about where you are now, where I was 25 years ago, the very ideas of this pre-college immersion in a topic have lasted and stuck with me for so long. And the idea of how we tell stories, how we understand our experiences in relationship to others, and how we use story to imagine other possible worlds. These are kind of through lines in my work. So I wanted to tell you just a little bit about myself as an introduction to this work. So these are some words that I identify with and think of myself as, and I'm going to just kind of buzz through some images that kind of are connected to some of these aspects of my identity. I have come to understand my identity as fluid and changing, and I suspect many of you have already come to that conclusion about yourselves too, how you understand yourself, how you move in the world. These are not kind of fixed identities, but rather, moving targets and amorphous kind of understandings of ourselves that are not linear necessarily. So those are some of the things that I kind of think of when I think of myself and my work. At USD, again, I teach in the music department, but I teach some courses that are not maybe what you might think of when you think of music at USD. I teach Introduction to Change Making. I teach a really cool class on community music, making music in community, music education for social change, topics in music teaching and learning, empowering song, and this really cool first-year course called We Shall Overcome, Singing for Freedom, Peace, and Justice. I also direct the choirs. I consider myself an artist. I am very interested in sound and the body and how we tell stories using both. This is a performance last May with the USD Choral Scholars. I am a parent. I have 2 kids. This is really an important aspect of my identity. This is George on the left signing the I love you hand sign. And my daughter, Ellie, in this bottom image, and you, I think, probably won't be able to hear this, but I'll just kind of show a couple seconds of the clip because Ellie is disabled. She's nonverbal and communicates using sign language and an iPad with an alternative communication tool on it. But kind of my experience as a parent of a person with a disability has really shaped my work and how I understand my role in the world. This is a little bit of Ellie. And you would be able to hear everybody else singing. She's very excited about signing, and she's not timid about it at all. Like, this is a school concert. Use your voice, sing it loud and strong. That's a little bit about Ellie. And George, who is her amazing brother. Oops, sorry. There we go. Again, just some photos of aspects of who I am. I grew up in the Midwest part of the United States to divorced parents. I was raised by a single mom. This is a picture of my mom and my sisters. My dad lived 2 hours away from me. I was shuttled back and forth frequently between 2 homes. That was pretty formative experience, still kind of thinking about what that means for me. And my own story, right? And what does it mean to have been in motion so regularly between places that I didn't quite feel a part of my own self as a young person? I was very dorky and was trying to find a place of belonging. Yes, the poster says crystallography is neat. You can tell it was like clearly a very popular kid. This is a picture of me in 4th grade singing in choir. I found in some ways belonging in music making in community, but in others, I found it in other aspects of that kind of communal music making, I found it to be very hostile actually to the feelings of belonging. And that question of how do you create belonging has been central to my work as a music educator. I liked to kind of hide in the background. I was not a soloist. I, preferred to be part of the chorus and to have kind of this internal experience singing other people's words. And that felt like a safe way for me to try on ideas and experiences, identities. When I studied music in college, I was also always interested in the larger world. I worked at a domestic violence shelter and at a rehabilitation facility for formerly incarcerated youth as an undergraduate. And more recently, I've been very interested and kind of consumed by some recent experiences. This is some photos. These are some photos from a direct action at Friendship Park, which is, when you come to San Diego and experience this is, well, you probably won't experience it because it's been closed since COVID and it's unlikely to reopen anytime soon. But, to approach the park, you go onto the sand of the beach and traverse from the San Diego side, traverse pretty kind of challenging terrain. And, these are some interfaith workers who came to do this direct action in the winter of 2018 after the arrival of the second migrant caravan in Tijuana. And I participated not in this direct action, but in a kind of adjacent action. And again, these kind of participating in kind of social movements, this has been part of my own story. I did this workshop in Calipatria State Prison. This was an extremely formative experience. I spent 72 hours being in dialogue as a participant in a workshop that was co-run by men on the inside and an outside facilitator. It changed my life to be in this space, to witness violence, to eat with these men, to talk with them, to make music with them, and then to come back and reckon with the fact that the majority of human beings in my community aren't thinking about these people, right? People living in cages, people brutalized, right? These are San Diego protests that I participated in after the murder of George Floyd. Again, these are moments in my own life that kind of are pinpoints in a sort of nonlinear understanding of my own story. Where do we go from here then? So we're talking about borders today, and my own creative work is largely is based in Tijuana. I work with community partners in shelters running arts projects, and have learned so much from being in relationship with these folks. Coming to San Diego, I moved here in 2014 and really didn't know a lot about the history of the border. I didn't really understand what it meant to be living here. And so these last many years have been ones of great learning. Again, I mentioned the 2018 arrival of the second migrant caravan in Tijuana. These are images from a moment in late November, I believe, of 2018, where migrants were kind of rushing the wall. They were, in this embankment of the Tijuana River. The U.S. military and Border Patrol shot tear gas into Mexico, and in again an effort to deter kind of a flood of migration across the border. Coming to know this place has raised a lot of questions about displacement more broadly, and I'm coming to understand displacement and forced migration as very broad, right? And can include things like homelessness and incarceration, internal displacement, and some of these keywords you can see here: gentrification, resettlement, etc. A couple of kind of scholarly things that I wanted to share with you today. I'm going to slow down here because this is sort of like part of what I really want you to take away from this conversation. What I've come to understand, both from my research and from being in relationship and traveling and visiting and being with migrants in a variety of contexts, is that the border, as we understand it, is not just spatial. It's not just geography, right? The border wall is where we focus so much of our attention, but really that border wall is only part of the story. And Harsha Walia, who Dr. LaFleur already mentioned today, really considers bordering as a set of policies and practices that are located at that geographic line between two nation states, but also exist internally, right? We think about the surveillance and policing of migrants within a country, within the United States, raids on workers and schools and community centers, deportation, right? Again, this happens as far away from the border as you can possibly be, right? And also external to the nation state itself, right? So we recently traveled to Tapachula in the state of Chiapas in Mexico and witnessed this at the southern border of Mexico, bordering Guatemala, and understood, how Mexico's policies regarding immigration and are really informed by the United States' policies, right? So that again, the border itself is not just this geographic line, but rather a set of policies and practices. And as Dr. LaFleur discussed already, that this is a site of, these are sites, non-geographic sites of violences, direct, structural, and cultural. Bordering policies impede motion, right? They stop the natural flow of motion. You think about migrating butterflies or whales who have no knowledge of the border that juts out into the sea, and migration is natural, right? And so these bordering policies and practices impede motion. And so it is in fact having to do with motion. And that's why I called this talk Moments and Movement. But it's also a temporal experience, right? And this is one of the things that I experienced really profoundly in Tapachula, where it just felt so palpable, people just waiting and waiting and waiting for their number to be called, waiting for papers, waiting for rights to pass through, always waiting. It's a very palpable experience. And so in this way, bordering policies are both spatial, having to do with movement, but also having to do with time, right? Borders reinforce the racialized, carceral, colonial, imperial, and capitalist conditions in which they have been traced. And I think this is really an important aspect of understanding borders and the violences of borders, and is something that we really need to interrogate. I have worked largely with Black migrants in Tijuana and in Tapachula, folks from Haiti and Cameroon and other countries in West Africa. And that's not like what comes to mind when you think of migration in Tijuana often. But migration is a racial issue, and it is the way that people move through the system more slowly or quickly really is dependent upon the country of origin and the race of the person who's applying for asylum. Often think about, for example, Ukrainian refugees who appeared at the border, and all of a sudden systems worked that weren't working before, and people were able to come through quickly. Whereas, there are folks who have been waiting for years in Tijuana to be able to cross from Cameroon and from Haiti. And, I think this illustrates that the system can work when it wants to work. And from a human rights perspective, folks from fleeing violence that's directed at them personally, so often folks from Latin America and from within Mexico actually have a more secure case for asylum, but are most often denied entry into the United States, whereas folks fleeing war kind of generally in the situation with Ukraine, they have like a less secure, less priority entrance in terms of asylum. So I think that that's kind of fascinating. I like to show this image when I'm talking about migration. This is a series of maps, right? You can see here in red, this is the country of origin of a person. And this set of images demonstrates how much of the world you have access to with your passport, right? So as an American citizen, here in this third little map, to the right in the first row, I have access to 157 countries, whereas my primary collaborator, who happens to teach at Boston University, he's from India, he only has access to 50 countries, right? And why is that? Why is that, right? Because of policies and practices that allow for movement or less movement, depending on your country of origin. And it's more complicated than that, but I think that it's a really good illustration to show that this is about movement, right? The ability to travel freely. Waiting, again, we're talking about waiting. This is some ideas that kind of I've come to recently from an Iranian scholar who's based in Sweden, Shahram Khosravi, talks about waiting and the practice of temporal bordering, which means delaying people, keeping people in waiting, keeping people in lines outside of embassies. I met so many folks waiting in line outside of detention facilities and outside of aid organizations, waiting and waiting and waiting. Waiting separates those who have the power to make others wait from people who don't have that power, and what that means in the body, right? Again, I'm really interested in the body and how we regard the body as artists in particular. I have the image that's behind me here on this slide that says migration is natural and courses through the blood of all life on earth. And a tweet from Zeli Imani, who writes, "The crisis is not at the border, the crisis is the border. Borders are not only created through violence, but also maintained through violence. Violence isn't happening at the border is violence." And here again, we also see Johan Galtung's triangle of violence. Again, my work is really in intervening in these cycles of violence. These are concepts that I learned back working in a domestic violence shelter. How do we intervene in cycles of violence? How do we create spaces for people to access human rights? So this image of these three types of violences is really kind of central again to my understanding of my own story. I wanted to briefly introduce you to one of the participants in one of the encuentros that I have facilitated in Tijuana. This is John. John is from Cameroon, and I'll show you a little bit about kind of his journey, the movement that he undertook to arrive in Tijuana and to travel now into the United States as an asylum seeker. We learned about John's story through a variety of artistic practices that are drawn from things like theater of the oppressed. And you can see John here depicting aspects of his story with another one of our facilitators from Mexico City. And here he's leading us in a song and teaching us a dance from Cameroon. And again, for some reason, I don't know why my audio is not sharing, but I'll show just a second of it so you can see kind of the joyful way that, he's teaching us, right? And that we are learning from him. This is at the community partner shelter space in Tijuana. It's busting. I wish you could hear the sound. Oops, here we go. So I took this image from a news article, and this describes Marilyn's journey, but this is actually also John's journey as he described it to us. John came from Cameroon, a war-displaced person, Cameroon still experiencing civil war between kind of post-colonial divisions, right? French-speaking and English-speaking folks in Cameroon. He traveled and took a flight into Ecuador. Ecuador has the least restrictive visa entrance requirements in the world, and so lots of migrants fly into Ecuador. He traveled then up Central America through some pretty perilous conditions, and then came to Tapachula, which is number 9 here on this map. I'll show you just a little bit of the geography in detail. coming from Colombia into Panama, there is a particularly dangerous area. It's notorious amongst migrants, called the Darien Gap. Lots of folks die in this part of the jungle. There are extremely poor conditions, lots of treacherous terrain, but also violence. Here's an image of folks moving through the Darien Gap. Everybody that I talked to in Tijuana and Tapachula talk about the Darien Gap and the fear that they experience. And in fact, the image here of John standing over Elisa, he's describing an experience that happened in the Darien Gap with his body. So again, here at the border of Guatemala and Mexico, Tapachula, this is the sort of epicenter of migration in North and South America. Most of the Mexican immigration policy is focused on keeping people in Tapachula, and it is described as an open air prison. And when I went and visited there, it was, the majority of humans in the city are forced migrants, right? And they're waiting for papers. They're waiting, considering declaring asylum in Mexico, which does not then, they can't then declare asylum in the United States. There's a lot of, human rights activism happening in Tapachula. Often, for example, the UNHCR is unable to provide services in Tijuana because they're only allowed to serve folks who are declaring asylum in Mexico, right? So a lot of resources are spent keeping folks in Tapachula. Lots of people travel up the back of Mexico in various dangerous ways, being smuggled in the back of semis or on top of trains like La Bestia here. Very dangerous ways of getting from one place to another. So now what, right? So I kind of spent some time storying myself, spent some time introducing you to John and to the larger context of migration in Mexico. As an artist, what to do now, right? I've spent the last many years theorizing and working on developing some practices for community music practitioners and music educators who are interested in expanding their practice to be more trauma-informed, more relevant, culturally relevant, more adaptable and responsive to kind of emergent crises like the crisis at the border. The 5 kind of like anchor points of this methodology of making music in these places that I learned from migrants and from folks in incarceration is that the body can be a source of memory, wisdom, trauma, joy, and ingenuity. That when we think of the self and our identities in relationship to others, we start to understand how political systems, how structures and human-created notions of statehood, for example, like animate the lived experiences of folks and kind of coming together then to make change. That stories are essential for making meaning out of experience, and that dialogue is something that we don't practice intentionally enough, especially in music education. This is, I think, one of the things I'm thinking about, number 4, a lot right now, is how music making in particular is well situated for intervening in acts of cultural violence, especially the act of cultural violence that is imposed by this experience of waiting, right? So music being a time-bound art form, if you can think about like a time where you were like really like engaged in a concert or listening to music with your headphones on, how like things melt away, how you're sort of transported to other possible worlds, how this can be like a source of healing, and how that works with time, right? Sometimes when you're like in that flow state, time moves more quickly than it does in real life, or sometimes time slows down, and how music making and this kind of flow state can impact your experience of time. What does that mean if you're waiting at the border, for example? And that, music making and the arts can be a source of a space for dreaming, for imagining what might yet be, for encountering the unknown. Here's some images of some of this work that I've done with Tijuana largely, right? You see the masks, we're talking about identity, we're thinking about imposed identities and authentic identities, how we author identity, really engaging the body, thinking about the body as, again, a source of creative ideas rather than just like a tool for, you know, delivering somebody else's idea. And here's a little video that I won't be able to play, I think now, but this is just this past June. I was in Tijuana at Espacio Migrante again and working here with about 30 migrants from Haiti who have all recently passed over to the US side. So this was a very long musical encounter with these lovely humans, and they taught us this song in Haitian Creole. We were singing and dancing. Every single individual had an opportunity to kind of be in the center and dance. It was a welcome ritual. And again, I had one of my students who participated. He's actually a war displaced person from Cote d'Ivoire. He came up to me during this and he was like, does anybody know how this ends? Because it was just going on and on and on and on and on, like a half an hour welcome ritual of the same song over and over and over. And I just loved, again, this intervention that was so rooted in time, right? That this took so long and it was such a joyful, expressive moment. You know, to be experiencing some discomfort with the length of time of this little encounter, you know, I think it was like so telling to how we kind of experience time and the privilege of being able to move quickly from place to place. This was such a beautiful ritual. You can see the first Haitian that you saw up there, he was talking, he was so excited to be able to teach us, and everybody was like really struggling with the Haitian Creole. It's very challenging thing. Such joy, conviviality, body, all of the things. So future projects that I've been kind of working on in the last couple months, I'm going into some trans-centered spaces in Tijuana, working with queer migrants, again, with story and song. I have a project, a grant to, again, engage with migrant youth in Mexico, but also in the West Bank. Collaborations with International Rescue Committee and Doctors Without Borders, thinking about secondary trauma and how the arts can intervene in these things. And then I'm really excited about this last project, which is a migrant authored songbook. It's not really a songbook, but basically thinking of migrants as experts in migration, right? And as songs, as something people can carry with them on the migration journey. And so we're going to be authoring or facilitating, you know, this kind of songwriting process and recording songs for folks earlier on in the journey, and kind of creating a QR code that we're going to, you know, distribute to shelters throughout Mexico so that folks can access these songs and add songs to the collection as well. All of this, again, stories, songs, movement, time, how we understand ourselves. These are human rights, actually, and in contexts of violence, the theory here is, of course, that, you know, culture can intervene in powerful ways as acts of resistance. And this is here, this is on the Tijuana side of the border. And that is it. So thank you very much, everyone.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, we'll move right to our last presenter, who is certainly not least, Dr. Pulido.
Great. Hi, everybody. I am going to try to put up a PowerPoint and hopefully it obeys, and we'll be able to share this with you. Okay, can everybody see that? Yes, good, I hope. And actually, I'm a slide ahead. All right, I'll be very specific with just trying to stick to what my slides have. And I know I'm trying to be mindful of time. It would be great to even have some people share. I want to thank my colleagues who have done some incredible presentations here. And my thought after having heard all three before me, what I'm feeling is there's these very unsettled issues within our lives that we're trying to figure out. And I think from the perspective of the humanities, from the perspective of wanting to decolonize our realities, we have a lot of work to do. What I want to do, which is just slightly different, it's actually, maybe mine is more optimistic, I'm not sure, but you can judge that at the end, is I recognize the tension, I recognize the contradictions, the sense of conflict, but I'm hoping that as we work with the arts, as we work with story, as we work with narrative, as we work with sacrality, like the sense of sacredness and orientation, that those are things that we can hopefully begin to build with in an attempt to address many of the things that Emilie was making reference to around the struggles within our communities around the trauma, which I think is very, very important. So I want to talk to you about Chicano Park. I'm glad it came up in the presentation. And I was really happy when Marni mentioned Anastasio Hernandez, because I want to share his story as well. And there's a lot we can do here. I just want to be very specific. And I want to share some videos with you that I hope are going to cooperate and work great. You notice the presentation is the history of Chicano Park and its monumental murals as orientation and sacredness. Here's a little bit about myself. Grew up here on the border. I established the Department of Ethnic Studies here. I have a really cool project called the Turning Wheel Project, which is a classroom on wheels. We were in Santa Barbara yesterday doing work with Santa Barbara, with the same work at a park called Ortega Park, helping with backpack distributions. If any of you are interested, this Saturday, we have a big event at Chicano Park, and it starts, I think, at 10. I'm very involved with the Chicano Park Steering Committee. I am the person in charge of the tours. We have a museum opening up in October, which I'm really excited about. And I also serve as the commissioner for the San Diego Arts and Culture Commission. I'm really dedicated to community epistemology, recovery work, and healing. There's my email if you wish to get a hold of me. I have a few learning objectives, and for those of you who have never heard about Chicano Park, those images on the left of the screen are different murals, and I'll talk about those in a second. I'll talk about how this all came to be. And that's my objectives are to learn the history of Chicano Park as activism, as resistance, to acknowledge that mural art as public art, and meaning that it's meant to educate and provoke thought and actions that lead to organizing and social change. And then to reflect on the concept of sense of home, sense of sacredness, centeredness, reinscribing activism and resistance. But again, with that point that this isn't like all neat. This isn't like a resolved issue. It's an ongoing, evolving process, and we draw from it when we can, and we build on it when we can, always recognizing that there's always going to be contradictions, and you're always going to have to deal with oppressive forces, but we still work. And I think what we like to say in the community is that's why we call it a struggle, okay? It's a struggle because you're always working. You're not gonna resolve it. If you think you're gonna resolve it, you're wasting your time. It's a daily issue that you confront and you kind of work with. And I think Chicano Park really embodies that whole question. So quickly, in 1970, a young man by the name of Mario Solis was walking through the neighborhood of Logan Heights, a neighborhood that had been radically changed, where 75% of the population had been removed because of Interstate 5 and because of the creation of the Coronado Bay Bridge. If you look at the slides, you see in the corner, the bridge going through the neighborhood of Logan Heights. you went from a neighborhood with 20,000 people to 5,000 by 1972. The community was pissed off. The community was angry. And I feel that the park was a way to bring people back together, symbolically anyway. Was no park because you're literally talking about an underpass on a highway. That's not really where parks are meant to be, but this was going to be what the space would represent. And people were asking and asking the city of San Diego for a park, but it fell upon deaf ears until Mr. Solis was walking through the park or through the space, and they saw there was construction workers, and he asked about the park that was coming, and he was told by the workers that they were actually going to build a highway patrol station. So that was kind of the last straw. And so he ran to a class he was having in Chicano Studies at City College. He organized his students, the teacher, and they all came back and stood on the land. They called out many other people. And by, I'd say by that afternoon, there were probably about 300 people there. The following day, elders came, food was brought in, definitely law enforcement came in, but they were able to withstand all of the conflict. And after 10 days of discussion, a park was authorized by the city of San Diego. And it's a very complicated story because you have to bring in the city and the state of California because the freeways are owned by Caltrans. Okay. So anyway, if you remember how I want to make this presentation around this notion of resistance and that those things that at times destroy us, if we work at it, and especially I think as Emilie was saying, if we use the arts, then we can transform those spaces. We can reinscribe them. We can retell them in a way that they become our own. Much more to tell you about this story, but I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what happened. And not a really ideal place for a park, mind you. You know, it's a real struggle. So 52 years later, we're still here. We very much consider this an occupied space from the perspective of the Chicano movement, from the perspective of some of the ideology and the teachings that go around this. If you'd like to learn more about that, come to my classes in ethnic studies and Chicano studies where we spend a lot of time. And recognizing that the issue today is the issue of gentrification and the issue of affordable housing, air pollution with the highest rates of asthma anywhere in the state of California. So it's an ongoing struggle and an ongoing issue. All right, here's the main sort of part of my presentation. I very much believe in mindfulness and what we like to call contemplative education. I sit on a board by the name of C-Mind. We're based out of Boston, out of Massachusetts, and our work is how can we bring more contemplative work into higher education. And I always find it ironic to be at a university such as this one with a faith-based foundation. And I honestly feel, having dealt with this many years on this campus, they're very afraid of this kind of a conversation. Okay, and it doesn't make any sense to me. But I just put in that plug because we should be a contemplative campus. I mean, there shouldn't be any reason why we can't be. Contemplative movements have been deeply part of the Catholic tradition, you know, and some of the most important contemplatives have come out of those traditions. But anyway, that's just my little soapbox there. So what I'm trying to get people to think about is a colleague's work by the name of Laura Rendon. And some of you have already heard me talk about this because I talk about this a lot. And I've been doing some writing in this area, that we need to connect both the mind with the heart as educators, as in terms of our pedagogy. You know, we do an excellent job of educating the heart, but of educating the mind. But we do a lousy job of educating the heart. And Rendon's research has proven that students of color, first generation students, marginalized communities think very much with their heart. And if you open that up as a pedagogy, it becomes super important. So in Spanish, it's called el sentir y el pensar. And so I want to invite you, you don't have to do this, I want to invite you to a moment of contemplative thought as you watch this video. And one of the things that we were talking about with regards to our sense of home in our prompt was sound. And of course, you can't address smell, but you can look at the visual. You can't touch, but you can imagine this. And again, I invite you to come out to the park to do this in full force. Questions: what are you observing? What questions, thoughts, ideas, emotions arise within? What are the people, the place, the objects, and agency teaching you? If we had more time, I'd want to spend maybe 20 minutes talking about this with folks about what they actually experienced here. I'm just going to play it, and then we're going to move forward. So let's hope my little video plays. There you go. So if we had time and could really sit and reflect and meditate and pray and, talk this out, it would be wonderful to get people's responses. And I intentionally just show you this video so to try to get you to figure out what it's about, what is it. Let me just say, this is the tallest mural at Chicano Park. It was finished during COVID. Victor Ochoa was the lead artist. It is the only mural that goes beyond the pillar and goes up to the top. And so I'm not going to show this whole thing, maybe about 5 minutes, but here you're going to get some context which is very helpful then to understand what's going on. So let me play this for about a few minutes, and then I'm going to stop it so I can end on time.
This mural came to be from direct invitation from Christian Ramirez. There was the director of the American Friends Service Committee at that time. We're dedicating it to Anastasio. He has passed away, has been murdered by these immigration agents.
The way that this mural was designed was with two components in mind, a healing side and more of a destructive side. So this side is the healing side, and there are more cool blue tones. There's teals and greens, very much representative of the earth.
We call this the water pillar, and that one is the fire pillar. You know, we view water, I think, traditionally as cleansing, as healing, and that energy of that flow of water serves that purpose on this mural.
We have at the bottom, anchoring the healing side, is a healing circle of women, and they're burning copal. So traditionally, copal is used in pre-Columbian ceremonies because that is what our ancestors are attracted to.
This piece has to do with what precipitated the actual beating of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas. When he was apprehended, my understanding is that he was told to drop the water bottle. And with his limited English, he thought they meant to empty the water bottle and began to empty it. The border agents used that as an excuse, viewing it as some sort of resisting arrest or something, and began to beat him at that point. He was subsequently handcuffed and on the ground when they began to kick him and tase him, and he was sent to the hospital. 2 days later, he died of his wounds, of his beating. We start with this bottle of water merging with the Rio Bravo or Rio Grande. That leads you to another very tragic scene, which is the scene of the father and daughter who drowned in the Rio Bravo a few months ago and were found there in the bushes.
The image of the father and the little girl that drowned, that was some image that popped up when we were in class last summer. And we really battled very hard with that image because it was so graphic and it was so powerful, and we would cry and we would argue like, no, we won't want it on there. No, we don't think, it's too painful. And we finally decided to put it in there. It's so powerful to me that they're face down, because it could be any ethnic group. You can't tell who they are. And to me, you can put anybody there. You can put anybody's face there, because it's happened so much.
This side represents more of the struggle. It also represents death. We have images of children who have been killed in Border Patrol custody, as well as images of hands that have been zip-tied together as someone who's been in Border Patrol custody or police custody. At the very top of the pillar, two things you'll see is, one, you'll see the scene captured on camera of Anastasio's beating, the tasering, and then what led to his death. But you also see images of children up there and a sign that reads, Futuro sin miedo, future without fear. So just as fire kind of consumes things, destroys things, it also leads to what we have on the other side, which is growth from struggle and growth from death.
The piece that is behind us here is the oldest son of Maria and Anastasio. His name is Fabian. Fabian, since his father was murdered, has not been able to leave his house. And so the only time he leaves is when he's accompanied by his mother. For us, like being out here and doing this joyously, I had to always remember this is not happiness for them. This is their tragedy. And it's in display like to the whole world what happened to them. So always being very respectful about how we address Maria, asking her permission, taking her into account anytime there was something that needed to be said was like, for me, that was huge for me, to make sure that she was blessing what was happening here.
I'm going to stop there. And I just hope that you picked up on what we've been talking about all this morning about that duality. In other words, you have the two columns and the pillar. And if you remember when you saw it, the pillar on the left represents the hate and the anger and the violence and the death. And the pillar on the blue represents the hope and the healing. And if you can recall, the mural, Anastasio is in the center. And if you look at him carefully, he's starting to transition. And behind him is a solar eclipse. And so it's this ongoing sort of struggle, how we sort of navigate this world in dealing with these questions around fronteras and around borders. And just like we heard about the violence at our border here in San Diego, we at the park have been subject to a lot of violence, particularly from a group by the name of Patriots Fire, with a guy named Ogden, Roger Ogden, who has made life difficult and has made situations pretty bad. And so even though we are not on the border, even though we are citizens of this country, we are still seen as wetbacks, and we're still seen as outsiders in the work that we do. Just to summarize, for you to think about, what have we learned about Chicano Park as activism and resistance in relation to home, memory, and orientation, about mural art as public art that is meant to educate and provoke thoughts and actions, reflect on the concept of homeland, sacred centers, orientation, and reinscription as future scholars and educational leaders. If I may say on that third one, that's my focus. That's that's where my heart is. How do we take a place that has been destroyed by powers that be and reinscribe it to making it our home? It's a sacred space. It's where a lot of sacred activities take place, and it's ours. And even within the city of San Diego, within all the complexities of having to work within the city of San Diego, it still represents part of that struggle. And so I think that's very important. And no, it doesn't get resolved. And no, it's not that everybody can live happily ever after, like, in the movies when the white guy with the hat runs off with the girl in the sunset. It's an ongoing struggle. It's really embracing what I like to call a community epistemology. And I believe very much in when you're going to learn, not only should you take, because what we do all the time at this university, but you also have to give. And I think that's about it. Let me end with a little invitation. This is a very short clip about Chicano Park, what we do, how we do it. And hopefully we'll see all of you on April 22nd, 2023, when we celebrate our Chicano Park Day again. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pulido. That was really, yeah, I mean, but I think we all come away from that feeling a real sense of the communities around us here. And I hope that all of you who are coming to USD soon, you don't restrict yourself to your community on campus. That's an important community, but there are many communities in San Diego, and I think all of the talks touched on this in different ways. There are lots of communities that you'll have a chance to join, to support, and so I hope you'll take that opportunity. So I want to thank all of our presenters today and invite very quickly some questions. We only have a few minutes, some questions that you might have arising from these presentations.
I know there was a question earlier in the chat, I think directed to Dr. LaFleur from Katerina. She writes, did they discover if the disappearance by terrain and predators was greater / less when the pigs were dressed versus not dressed?
Oh, yeah, there's actually no significant difference. So it does slow down decomposition a small amount, but that amount is not significant. So it didn't actually make a big difference.
Many of our talk states, we're focused on social justice. So I wonder if any of you have any questions about that or thoughts about how we can engage with that, how we as you as students might be able to. Maybe you have questions about how you can get involved or thoughts about how you'd like to engage, especially if you're not from this area. You may have some questions about the struggles that are happening right in our backyard.
I think Atsuchena has a question.
Yeah. What he was saying, what can we do to get involved? Because this topic of immigration is something that I'm really interested about, and it's something I'm really passionate about. So are there any ways we as students can get involved?
I think any of you could field that. Does somebody want to take that up? I think it'll be our closing remarks too. So this is a great way to end our program today.
Well, my immediate thought is you should become an undoc ally here on campus. We have undocumented students on this campus. There's a lot of activity going on. And I would get involved with the Mulvaney Center as well. They do a lot of good work. And I think each one of these professors would be a good way to connect, including me. So anyway, yeah, that's my quick thought.
I would also add, when you're going to activities fairs, that I think this will be the first week of classes, there'll be lots of clubs. Lots of them are social and fun, but you all are part of a USD community, and many of you have chosen to come to USD because these kind of issues are important to you. So there are lots of activist clubs on campus too. Some of them participate with the Mulvaney Center or with the DACA allies, but there's I don't have the list right now, but there are lots of those student groups that are focused around activism and advocacy and being engaged with the community.
That's right. In your first weeks, there'll be something called Alcala Bazaar, which will be a showcase for all of the various student groups. And like I said, there are lots of communities you can join on campus, but there are many of those groups also work off campus to support communities, to work on social justice. So definitely when you're walking around Alcala Bazaar, I think you make friends and you tend to hang with your friends, but branch out. If folks aren't going in the direction you want to go, just walk over. They're all in different sections. Walk over to the section that has to do with community groups, that has to do with social justice. Check things out and check out the whole of Alcala Bazaar. It's easy. It's very big and it can be overwhelming. It's easy to sort of get stuck in one area. Just walk around and sign up for a list. You can always say, I don't have time for that later. I would say start off by getting to know more things, and then you can you make sure that you don't miss out on things. The number of students who say to me when they're juniors or seniors, boy, I wish I had known about this years ago. Well, this is your chance to know. So I definitely recommend that you check out all of the opportunities in your first weeks on campus. Talk to your LLC professors as well. They can help you get connected to some great things. Well, again, thank you so much. This has been such an excellent way to end and a really excellent course throughout. I want to thank all of you students, and we look forward to seeing you on campus.